CBDC is an acronym that most of us had never even heard of 6 months ago, and now it's dominating headlines as central banks around the world contemplate launching a digital currency. Now, China is leading the way, and the Fed will be releasing a discussion paper this summer about the benefits and costs of a CBDC. Well, either way, Fed Chair Jerome Powell says this cannot happen without congressional approval. But does it need to happen? Does the US need a digital dollar, and what does it entail? To discuss, we're joined by a leader and pioneer in the digital currency and blockchain space, Cameron Chell. He is the executive chairman and co-founder of CurrencyWorks, a financial technology blockchain pioneer, cryptocurrency provider, and a market leader in the development of trading platforms for NFTs. Cameron, great to have you here on Kitco with us.
Always so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Cameron, the conversations about CBDCs are really heating up. Here in the US, we had two Federal Reserve officials recently expressing very strong skepticism about the need for the Fed to issue a digital currency. And one point being made is that many dollar transactions are already virtual. So how would a digital dollar be any different from what we have if you consider that most of today's money is effectively digital? Direct deposits, paychecks, credit and debit cards, PayPal, Venmo, Apple Pay. So why would we need a digital dollar?
Well, I think there's a big distinction between a digital dollar and a dollar that moves digitally. So what we experience today are dollars that move digitally. So I've got a representation of a dollar bill in my bank account. I'm transferring it to Whole Foods through my Apple Pay account. They're receiving a dollar. But the back end transaction, the back end functionality of that is really rooted in 2 or 3 year old century technology and notions. A digital dollar is something that has function far beyond just the transfer of money. And so it's inevitable that national currencies or sovereign currencies will come into an effect. It just is too inefficient when you've got some nations that have access to use these digital dollars. And I'm happy to give good examples of why these will become important, as opposed to some that won't use it. So it's really an inevitability.
An inevitability. Okay, so explain why it has to be an inevitability.
Well, first and foremost, the issuance of currency in an electronic form is much less expensive than the issuance of currency in a physical form. That alone will save billions of dollars per year. But now when you really get into it and you want to understand how to invoke your monetary or your fiscal policy, being able to do it from the core piece of software as opposed to trying to manage massive amounts of money that's physically in a market is highly inefficient to when you can constrict or open up your money supply instantly. So fiscal and monetary policy development, tax collection, game changer. Now all of a sudden you've got a decentralized technology being run in a centralized system. You can actually monitor, track, withdraw taxes, supply benefits, incent your population, all of those things instantly. As a political tool, if we think about being able to invoke or monitor sanctions on companies or countries or bad actors, when you've got instant access to wallets and constricting money supply, it's an entire new tool that really we haven't seen the likes of. And it's just these are just about a few of the reasons that we see major governments now not just looking at it, but actually implementing it.
Well, I do certainly want to touch on all of those factors that you mentioned as to why it's very beneficial for governments to have this. But before we get there, I just want to get a little bit more clarity on what exactly a digital dollar is. Does it mean that, transactions are now being handled by the Fed, that we're cutting out the banks as intermediaries? What does it exactly mean when you say, sure, we've been using dollars digitally, but they haven't been issued digitally? So what does that mean?
Yeah, so I mean, the purists in the environment would suggest that everything needs to be totally decentralized, and you don't have, a policymaker in the middle. And I think we're a long way from that happening. I do think that we'll see private currencies or things like cryptocurrency have their place within the entire ecosystem.
But I'm focusing on the Fedcoin, on the Fed dollar, if you will. If the Fed issues a digital dollar, what does that mean?
What it means is that they have the ability to control or manage the money supply. It's really a piece of software that exists on something like a blockchain that enables them to create scarcity, right? And monitor every single dollar, if you will, every single block that is in circulation. And that's really and so by doing that, they can instantly invoke fiscal and monetary policy.
All right, well, to some, that sounds rather terrifying, quite frankly. I mean, there are a lot of big concerns, and you have to wonder when this is so appealing to the People's Bank of China and they're leading the way that it's perhaps not the best for individuals, because a digital currency, to your point, means total control of every currency unit. You're able to know where every single yuan in the case of China or dollar in the case of the US is. You can't avoid income taxes. You can restrict people's ability to use this. All the units are registered on the blockchain. No counterfeiting is possible. I mean, I can see why this would really appeal to the People's Bank of China. And that's why they're leading the way in launching a digital yuan. But some would argue that this is not aligned with American values of liberty and freedom, or at least what we would like them to be or thought of what they are. And that with a digital dollar, the government will know everything about you, everything you spend money on, every time you get paid for everything. Is that lack of privacy and total control not a concern for you?
No, absolutely it is. And I think the points you bring up are excellent points. And these are the less appealing pieces of the whole digital economy, if you will. I would liken it very similar to, when the states, seceded the currency to the Fed, when they, wait a minute, you're going to have total control on everything. And in effect, they do, because they control that money supply. The difference is in the policy and in the laws. And so as we move forward with digital currencies, those policies and laws are going to have to mature or evolve in order to reflect our American society, our values, and not be in a situation where you've got the Chinese government, issuing, credits based on how many times I say, something popular about communism. It's incredibly challenging, and it's incredibly daunting, and it's potentially very scary, but probably no more scary than the level of control within any government that's ever happened as the money supply has matured through technology.
Is the idea here to remove cash from the system at some point? Physical cash, physical notes, physical coins?
Yeah, there's nothing easier, not that I have any real experience with it, but there's nothing easier to launder or to abuse than a US dollar for lots of reasons. And so if we want to be in a position to be able to take out that abuse or that inefficiencies, then the general removal of cash is something that's going to happen.
So you're seeing this as the start of a cashless society?
Absolutely.
That once this is adopted, my dollar notes are going to be worthless at some point.
Well, I mean, it's not going to be adopted instantly, and it's going to have transition over time. And if we look at any currency that has been phased out, it still has value. It still has collector value. It's, if it exists, it will still have value. But as those notes are slowly taken out of circulation and replaced with digital currencies throughout the entire world, across probably all currencies, eventually, they'll have collector value, and that will be it.
Well, Cameron, people find this idea of removing cash from the system quite terrifying, and they think it's been argued that this digital dollar is part of the bigger plan to phase out cash and coins, which would give government total control over transactions. And to your point, you look at currencies of other countries, like, for example, European countries before they adopted the euro. I mean, I have lira notes, but they're completely worthless. I have some South African rand notes that have been taken out of circulation. They're no longer accepted. So if the government puts out the digital dollar and then at some point declares that paper currencies are not accepted anymore, starts phasing them out in favor of digital currencies, they're able to exercise even more and more control.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a scary proposition. However, I do believe economics are dictating that we have greater and greater efficiency in the market. And the greatest or the easiest way to create efficiency is to remove friction. So when things can become instant, and when it's just not the transaction, it's just not the transfer of a dollar that's instant, but it's also the understanding and the accounting of the transaction behind it, so that all the ensuing ecosystem, also is immediately accounted for. That's where there's this incredible transaction, supply chain efficiency, and the list goes on and on. And I think economically, that's what will drive it. Now, ultimately, it is much more convenient for people to use it as well. So I think adoption is going to become inevitable as well. But if we are not careful with our policy and our laws, we are in for a controlled society.
Yeah, well, many people would find that quite terrifying, Cameron. But let's focus on the positives, because you say it's inevitable anyway. So let's focus on some of the other factors that would be involved with this. And to your point, some say that electronic payments between individuals or businesses would be instantaneous. They would be permanent. There'd be no need for a bank to serve as an intermediary, and individuals without access to bank accounts could easily receive secure electronic payments. Let's break that down a little bit. I mean, does this mean that we're going to cut out the middlemen and the banks? What would that mean for traditional banking then?
I don't think so. I think that at the root of all this, though, I do think electronic blockchain AI type technology will become more and more trusted. I do think that it's really important from a sociological standpoint that we do have a trust agent involved. Now, I do think how that trust agent is involved and what that trust agent looks like, being the bank, will change dramatically over the course of the next decade. But I do believe that they still will be involved. Somebody's going to have some level of accountability over that code, some level of accountability over things like customer service or mistakes or such. Now the big advantage here is that cost infrastructure of that trust agent, that bank or whoever is involved, will drop significantly, which then brings more people into the economy. And I don't mean just people in the United States. I mean the total global economy, where somebody in a remote economy will have as much access and opportunity into the global opportunity as everywhere else. It really eliminates geographics. And by doing this, you really grow the entire economy. So while we'll see the role of banks and trust agents change significantly, I do not think that we will see them disappear. It's just really important to know that there is a human interaction, that there is a sociological interaction between me and my money and you and your transaction. And so therefore, I do think that there's a role for that trust agent going forward.
And who would be that trust agent? Would it be the Fed?
Be called a bank. It still absolutely may be called a bank. But the bank that we know today is very different than the bank that we knew 25 years ago or 100 years ago. But it's still a bank. It's still that trust agent. And so I do think that that tradition, if you will, or that requirement within our kind of social pattern will continue to need to be there. Will it absolutely need to be there for the transaction to happen? No, I think the banks basically right now, those transactions are happened by software, but we still need that place to go to hold accountability on the regulation and the transaction itself.
Okay, Cameron, you mentioned how a digital dollar would make it easier for people outside the US to exchange payments in US dollars. But on the flip side of that is the concern that it could then undermine local currencies, that it could be bad for countries trying to manage a national currency. If the dollar were to supplant the local currency of an African country, for example, let's go with Zambia, then the digital dollar becomes the preferred medium of exchange over the Zambian kwacha, and then it could damage the buying power of individuals reliant on the local currency, on the Zambian kwacha, and the local central bank's ability to then use monetary policy to manage its own money supply. And that could unleash a range of potentially chaotic economic consequences. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, these are problems that these geographic regions are faced with today. And so that's why we see, currencies being restricted in certain areas or not being accepted in some areas, or the US being very careful about, where its money flow gets into. And so, but the ability to do that, quite frankly, with software is much easier to do that than to be able to do that with, something like a physical currency. So when you've got a Zambian currency interacting with a US currency, or the US currency being able to be transacted in that geographical area or in a particular industry, it really much is now not necessarily from a policy perspective, but certainly from a distribution and the software perspective, it's much easier to code in where that can and can't be spent, or where you can put incentive in for it to be spent or not spent. You can literally change your currency regulator on your dollar, if you will, between two different currencies in live time. Now, again, I don't think that we're anywhere within the next decade of that happening, but that's the type of flexibility that you now have when you've got a true digital currency infrastructure.
And is this happening on people's phones? Is this an app? Is this a digital wallet? How do these transactions take place?
Well, so I think there's lots of theories around that, but I do think that there is, basically everybody will have a wallet or a series of wallets, and one or two wallets that are most important to them. And that's where these wallets will have these interactions. Eventually, the US dollar will be, an API, an application interface, whereby, it can change policies on a daily basis if needed in order to help manage its own fiscal or monetary or political policies. And when it does that, or when different currencies do that around the world, it will have, a net effect into my particular wallet. And yeah, it'll all be happening on phones or mobile devices of some sort, for sure.
What happens if you don't have a phone, if you run out of battery, if you have bad signal, if you have bad Wi-Fi? Are you going to be in a position where it's not like, oh, my battery's dead, but I still have cash, so I can still pay for my cab home? Are you going to be in a position where a scenario like that becomes impossible, like 2-3 decades down the line, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, on off cases, absolutely that those types of things are going to happen. But that's part of why electronic money, or even digital transactions, as you talked about in the first part of this conversation, they take time to progress, because the rest of that infrastructure and the rest of the habitual changes of society have to be implemented so that those fail safes are in place. You can say the same things today. Well, what if I don't have a US dollar and I'm in a different country? Well, I just make sure I'm in a position where I've got enough US cash with me and I'm in a different country so I can spend you. What if I lose my wallet? Well, same thing. What if my battery goes dead? I have to take some level of personal responsibility to ensure that I do have, the ability to transact. And that has become incredibly easy in second and first world countries now. And that, if we see the amount of energy backup that's happening, if we see the amount of redundancy in terms of coverage around the world and satellites and all the rest of it, it will be entirely ubiquitous. But you do raise a good point that ubiquity cannot happen until the rest of that infrastructure is also in place.
So, nightmare scenario, you mentioned satellites. What if there is some massive cyber hacking, some massive cyber attack? Somebody takes out satellites. We don't have the Space Force ready to go yet, so it's a possibility. What if that happens? How much of a concern is that?
Well, it's probably, again, if you look at things statistically, it's probably going to happen. Right now, it may not be in our lifetime, and it may happen for only 2 minutes of an entire, not for a year or something like that. But those types of things have to be accounted for. And I do think that there will be money supply out there that will have backup for that, and very quickly, society will move to physical interaction of things. I know of some incredible companies right now that are doing work with cryptocurrencies in a physical form. They're doing incredible work with gold in a physical form as a currency. So like literally $2 or $3 of gold in an atomically layered format right now. And I do think that many of those things will be available through the private sector. What I do see is I see governments getting out of the business of providing that physical capability, because it's so expensive. It's so hard to monitor. And so we'll certainly always have a way to transact in those particular cases.
Well, you mentioned cryptocurrencies, and some are saying that this could signal the end of the road for the use of private cryptocurrencies. Elizabeth Warren, who's been very critical of cryptocurrency recently said at a Senate Banking Committee policy hearing that, and I quote, legitimate digital public money could help drive out bogus digital private money. What impact do you think this would have on altcoins, digital currency, cryptocurrencies, whatever you want to call them?
Well, I think it has some significant impact. And quite frankly, if the governments don't take a position of having cryptocurrencies, like currencies that they can manage in that way from an electronic manner, they're going to get outdone by cryptocurrencies. So I think what they're doing here is proactive in the sense that it'll allow them to invoke policy better, but they're also doing it in a defensive manner because it's probably the only way to truly combat some other cryptocurrencies becoming somewhat dominant. And they don't have to be dominant, but if they even had 3 or 4 or 5% of the global GDP, that would be an incredible disruptive force into their fiscal and monetary policies. So they need to be able to provide an alternative. It's really some market driving forces here that are working to hopefully all of our benefit, so that they can provide an alternative. Now, by doing that, I do think they can keep those currencies in check. Now, I do also personally believe that they'll have to have some level of collaboration with those, because I do think that some very, very large organizations. So, look, we have some companies in this country that are larger than most countries in the world in terms of the GDP. And they're going to have their own currencies. They're going to have their own currency to manage just their own treasury or their own supply chain or their own reward and loyalty points. And all of those things will have value against the new, let's call it US digital currency. But I think those can all be coded in so that my Apple bucks someday will actually be immediately transactable into the US dollar. Now, it may have some restrictions on where and how I can spend it and stuff like that. But I do, to your point, 100%, the governments, they're going to keep cryptocurrencies in check by being competitive, not necessarily by trying to outregulate them.
So as we move along with the digital dollar, what does it mean to a currency like, a store of asset value rather, like Bitcoin? Does Bitcoin trade down on news that this will happen, or trade up because of the sort of alternative that it provides? How do developments here impact Bitcoin, do you think?
I believe it's going to trade up in Bitcoin's case for a couple of reasons. One, as you mentioned, it's more of a store of a value as opposed to a transactional piece of currency, if you will. The second is that Bitcoin really has become, because of the stored value, because of the limited supply that will be out there, it's really become an inflation hedge, right? So it's kind of like the new man's gold. Not that gold doesn't have its place, but so I believe that the adoption of cryptocurrencies by centralized banks will signal adoption of the technology. And I think there's more upside through the general public of them going, hey, wait a minute, these things are okay. Now, in the case of many other currencies that are trying to be transactable or trying to be anti-government, rage against the machine type of currencies, I think it's going to spell doom for them.
So if I may summarize that, this will be good for Bitcoin, but potentially bad for something like Dogecoin.
Yeah. If something doesn't have utility and it doesn't have real function, I think it's going to be very, very challenging. If Dogecoin, for example, has attraction to it because people want to be able to use it to do anonymous transactions and all the rest of it, it's got a short life. And when I say short life, I mean a decade, which is a very short life in terms of currencies. Autonomy autonomy and avoidance are not going to be good reasons for a currency.
All right, well, Cameron, as we discussed, the major factor driving this is this need to keep up with China, which led the way here. China's already running trials of its digital yuan. And as I hit on earlier, a lot of people are concerned that we're following the lead of the People's Bank of China because it may have other more nefarious ideas behind launching a digital currency, as discussed, like complete and total control. But the argument is that if the US doesn't catch up here, if the US falls behind its superpower rival, then it's going to be in jeopardy, that the US has to keep up. It's almost like a FOMO, not wanting China to win ultimately. But is that in the best interest, given that the dollar still enjoys a very different status than the yuan? I mean, does this ultimately hurt or help the dollar as a global reserve currency?
If it doesn't evolve, it will fall behind in so many aspects. Also, I think that, the US is a leader. And I also personally really believe in the US and the population and what we all stand for. Quite frankly, we need to be competitive, and we need to be able to provide a centralized cryptocurrency, if I can call that, or a national cryptocurrency that doesn't stand for the things that the Chinese currency is standing for. And I think if we do that and we do that well, and I do believe that through policy and law and our constitution, that we can do that really well. And if we do it, then we actually provide an even better alternative today than to what the Chinese currency is really representing, because the Chinese currency is not representing free market. It's not representing trying to take friction out of the system. It's representing control. Right. And so I think people will fly away or take flight from that control into some alternative. But the alternative won't be a physical greenback dollar. It will have to be something that's really transactable and global and represents the freedom that people really want. And that's where I think the opportunity for the United States is to even become more dominant.
All right, Cameron, I'm going to leave it on that optimistic and positive note. And it's very good to hear that you have all of this faith in American institutions to still champion those traditional American values. Reaffirms my faith. So Cameron, thank you so much for joining us. Cameron Chell, Executive Chairman and co-founder of CurrencyWorks. Really appreciate that very thorough, detailed breakdown. Thanks.
Michelle, thank you as always.
And thank you for watching Kitco News. I'm Michelle Makori, and I'll see you next time.